Take a breath and dim the lights if you like. Tonight, we step into the shadows of a forgotten empire. Long before skyscrapers and neon skylines, China was ruled by powerful dynasties, and none more ambitious than the first, the Qin. In the heart of ancient Xi'an, buried beneath the earth for over 2,000 years, a silent army waited, carved from clay, standing guard over a man who believed he would rule even in death. This is the story of the Terracotta army and the emperor who couldn't let go. Let's begin. What if an entire army could tell the story of an ancient civilization? The Terracotta army isn't just a breathtaking archaeological find. It's a time capsule from a world we're still trying to understand. Until a handful of farmers struck something unexpected in Xi'an, no one imagined that thousands of life-size clay figures, each with their own features and ranks, had been hidden underground for over 2,000 years. Fragments of pigment still cling to some of their armor, hinting at once vibrant colors that faded almost instantly when exposed to air. What might have driven a ruthless empire to replace real people with clay figures? To understand that, you have to look at what life was like before these soldiers were made. In ancient China, the reality for many people was shaped by a harsh and unyielding social order. For those born into the service of the elite, their lives were often at the mercy of tradition. Human sacrifice was a deeply rooted practice, especially among the ruling classes. When a king or noble died, it was common for their servants, guards, and companions to be buried with them. This wasn't just about honoring the dead. It was about ensuring that the elite would have everything they needed in the afterlife. The expectation was that loyalty and service didn't end with death. They continued on, no matter the cost to the living. The idea behind these sacrifices was simple, but brutal. The elite believed that the afterlife mirrored the world they knew. To maintain their status and comfort, they needed familiar faces and loyal hands by their side, even if it meant those people had to die when the ruler did. These acts were seen as necessary, not cruel by those in power. But for the people chosen and for their families, the experience was one of loss and fear. Communities could be left grieving as skilled workers, advisors, or soldiers were taken from them, all in the name of tradition. Over time, the practice of ritual killings started to weigh on society. It wasn't just the loss of life that troubled people, it was the disruption it caused. The death of valuable members of society weakened families and communities. The system depended on the very people it was destroying. As the years passed, unease about these sacrifices grew. More people began to question whether this was the right way to honor the dead. The morality of the practice and its impact on society became harder to ignore. There wasn't a sudden rebellion, but a slow shift in thinking began to take hold. The pressure to find another way grew as the drawbacks became clear. Some rulers and thinkers started to look for alternatives that would allow them to respect tradition without causing so much suffering. Early experiments began with substituting real people with simple objects or figures. These substitutes were humble at first, small, basic, and not much more than a gesture. But the idea caught on, and over generations, the practice of using symbolic figures began to take root. It was a compromise that let the elite keep up appearances while sparing human lives. By the time of Qin Shi Huang, the use of symbolic figures had evolved. What started as basic representations became more ambitious. The need for substitutes was more than just about morality, it was practical. The state needed its people alive to maintain power and stability. As the tradition of human sacrifice faded, the challenge was to create something that could truly stand in for a living army in the afterlife. The solution would have to be convincing, impressive, and worthy of an emperor who saw himself as larger than life. This transition didn't happen overnight. It was the result of generations of change, people quietly pushing back against a practice that had defined their society for centuries. The move from real sacrifices to symbolic ones marked a turning point. It showed that even the most deeply held traditions could adapt when enough people saw the need for change. The shift was both a practical response to societal pressures and a sign of growing awareness about the value of human life. What came next would be unlike anything seen before. The ambition to create an army out of clay, one that could serve in the afterlife just as real people once had, was a leap that required vision, resources, and a willingness to break from the past. It was a solution that would redefine how an entire civilization viewed death, loyalty, and remembrance. The story of how this idea took shape and how it turned into one of the most remarkable archaeological finds in history begins with a single, bold question. How do you replace real people in the afterlife?
Instead of turning to more loss and grief, Emperor Qin Shi Huang and his advisors chose something different, something that would change how an entire civilization remembered its dead. They decided to create an army out of clay. The Terracotta warriors weren't just a symbolic gesture. They were a complete transformation of an old tradition. This solution was as ambitious as it was practical, and it marked a new era in how people thought about the afterlife and the value of human life. When you look at what they built, the scale is hard to imagine. Archaeologists uncovered thousands of lifelike clay warriors, each one standing about as tall as a real person. But it's not just the numbers that are impressive, it's the individuality. Each figure is unique. The faces are all different, with distinct expressions, hairstyles, and even subtle details like the way the lips are set or the brows are shaped. Some warriors have beards, others are clean-shaven. Their stances and uniforms aren't all the same either. This wasn't mass production in the way we think of it today. It was a careful effort to capture the diversity and organization of a real army. The details go even deeper. Archaeologists have studied the warriors and found that their hairstyles, called hagirs, and their armor clearly show differences in rank. A general's armor stands out, more ornate and layered, while a lower-ranking soldier's gear is simpler. The way the hair is tied up, or the style of the helmet, gives away who's who in the army. These little differences aren't just for show. They reflect the military structure of Qin Shi Huang's forces. This attention to hierarchy and realism tells us a lot about the society that made them.
Building this army wasn't the solitary job. It took a huge team effort. Craftsmen worked together in workshops, each group specializing in different parts of the figures. The heads, bodies, arms, and legs were made separately, often using molds for the main shapes. After assembly, the finer details, like facial features and hair, were added by hand. Stamps and inscriptions on some of the figures show that these teams of craftsmen signed their work, highlighting their pride and the importance of their roles. This wasn't just labor, it was skilled artistry. And the people who made these warriors knew their work would last. The clay itself came from the local area around Xi'an. Once shaped, the figures were fired in kilns at carefully controlled temperatures to make sure they would survive underground for centuries. What's left today is mostly the bare clay, but archaeologists have found faint traces of pigment on some of the figures. These fragments hint that the army was once covered in bright colors, reds, blues, greens, making the soldiers look even more lifelike when they were first buried. The colors faded quickly once exposed, but those tiny bits of paint give us a glimpse into how striking the army must have looked in its original state. The tomb complex isn't just about the soldiers either. There are also clay horses, chariots, and even figures representing musicians and acrobats. All of this was meant to recreate the emperor's world, so he would have everything he needed in the next life. The scale and detail are almost overwhelming. And it's clear that this was more than just a way to honor the dead. It was about power, legacy, and the belief that the emperor's rule should continue forever.
Qin Shi Huang was the first emperor to unite China, and he saw himself as a ruler without equal. His tomb reflects that ambition. He wanted protection and loyalty in the afterlife just as he had in life, but he also wanted to show that his reign had changed the world. Replacing human sacrifice with clay figures wasn't just a moral decision, it was a statement about progress and the future. The Terracotta Army stands as proof that a society can adapt its traditions, finding new ways to balance respect for the past with the needs of the present. Even with everything we know, the Terracotta Army still leaves us with questions. Why did the emperor go to such lengths to prepare for the afterlife? Was it fear of what came next, or just a desire to hold on to power? And why did the army remain hidden for so long, forgotten beneath the earth? The tomb complex itself is still only partly explored, with rumors of hidden chambers and treasures waiting to be found. Each discovery adds new pieces to the puzzle, but the full story is still out of reach. What's certain is that the Terracotta warriors represent a turning point, not just for one emperor, but for an entire civilization. They show how creativity and craftsmanship can replace violence, and how the desire to remember and honor can lead to some of humanity's most impressive achievements. For centuries, these figures stood in silence, unknown to the world above. Their story was waiting, just beneath the surface, for someone to stumble upon it and bring it back to life.
In 1974, just outside Xi'an, a group of farmers were digging a well when they hit something unexpected. At first, just some broken pieces of pottery. Nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary. But then they found a life-size clay head. That stopped them. It wasn't just a chunk of pottery. This was something detailed, something that looked like it belonged to a person. The farmers didn't know it yet, but they'd just uncovered the beginning of what would become one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The scene must have felt strange. You're out there digging for water, and then you start pulling pieces of what looks like a statue from the ground. Not just one or two either. As they kept digging, more pieces showed up. Arms, torsos, hands. It was clear this was more than an old pot or a forgotten relic. The farmers realized they needed help, so they reached out to the local authorities. Soon, an archaeological team arrived to investigate, and that's when the real work started. Once the archaeologists got involved, they began to see the scale of what was buried. The fragments weren't random, they were all parts of life-size clay soldiers. It wasn't just a handful either. As the team kept digging, they realized they were standing on top of thousands of these figures, all lined up in rows like an army, ready for battle. Alongside the soldiers, they found clay horses, chariots, weapons, and all sorts of other objects. The more they uncovered, the bigger the sight seemed to get.
It's hard to picture just how much was hidden under that field. The pits stretched on and on, filled with row after row of warriors. Each one was about as tall as an average person. But what really stood out was the detail. The faces weren't all the same. Some had mustaches, some didn't. The hairstyles were different. And so was the armor. Archaeologists noticed that the way the hair was tied up, the style of the armor, and even the stance of each figure pointed to a specific rank or role in the army. Generals stood out with more elaborate armor and confident poses. Foot soldiers looked more rigid, with simpler gear. Even the horses and chariots had their own touches. Bronze fittings, carefully shaped legs, and heads that made them look ready to move. As they kept working, the team realized this wasn't just about the emperor wanting protection in the afterlife. The army was a snapshot of the society that built it. The way the soldiers were arranged, the differences in their appearance, and the effort put into each one all pointed to a highly organized, skilled, and hierarchical culture.
The discovery gave researchers a way to see the Qin dynasty's military structure up close, not just through old texts or records, but in three-dimensional detail. The process of digging out the army was slow and careful. Each figure had to be uncovered with the right tools so nothing would break. Archaeologists took notes, mapped out the site, and tried to piece together how everything fit. The warriors weren't just lined up on the surface, many had collapsed or broken over time, so there was a lot of work involved in cleaning, restoring, and sometimes reassembling them. Some of the weapons found with the army were still in surprisingly good condition. Swords, arrowheads, and spear tips had survived, some even coated with an early form of anti-rust treatment that kept them sharp after centuries underground. This wasn't just about art. It was about technology and innovation.
What surprised a lot of people was how this discovery changed the way we look at ancient China. Before, most of what we knew about the Qin dynasty came from books and a few old ruins. The Terracotta army changed that. Suddenly, there was physical proof of what the texts described, proof that was much more detailed and vivid than anyone expected. The craftsmanship was clear in every figure, from the folds in their clothes to the way their armor was put together. Even the smallest details, like the way a hand gripped a weapon or the folds in a sleeve, showed how much care went into making each piece. The discovery also became a point of pride for people in China and around the world. What started as a regular day for a few farmers turned into a story that drew millions of visitors and researchers to Xi'an. The site became a symbol of China's long history and its capacity for creativity and organization. It's not just an archaeological site now. It's a place where you can see the ambitions and abilities of a whole civilization. The Terracotta army also raised new questions. How did the craftsmen manage to make so many unique figures? What tools and methods did they use? And why did the army stay hidden for so long? The site is still being studied, with archaeologists continuing to dig, restore, and learn from what's left. Every new find adds a bit more to the story of the Qin dynasty and its first emperor, but there's still a lot that isn't fully understood. One thing that caught researchers' attention early on was the hint of color on some of the figures. When the army was first uncovered, archaeologists noticed faint traces of paint clinging to the clay. These colors suggested that the warriors didn't always look the way they do now. That discovery opened up a whole new set of questions about how the army was made, what it looked like originally, and what those colors meant to the people who created them.
The real surprise came when archaeologists started lifting figures from Pit 3. Instead of just gray clay, they found striking hues of red, blue, green, and even a chemical purple still clinging to the surface. These weren't the faded remains you might expect after thousands of years underground. For a brief moment, the warriors looked almost as if they'd just been painted. The discovery challenged what everyone thought they knew about the Terracotta army. People had always imagined these figures as plain and colorless, but suddenly it was clear they'd once been anything but. The colors, though, didn't last. Within moments of being exposed to air, the pigments started to flake off and disappear. The soil had kept the paint sealed in, but once that layer was gone, the colors couldn't hold on. It was a real problem for the archaeologists. They wanted to learn from the colors, maybe even preserve them, but they were vanishing right before their eyes. The team tried to act quickly, using protective solutions to stabilize the pigments. Sometimes it worked, but often the best they could do was document what was left before it faded away. This challenge made it clear just how fragile the legacy of the Terracotta army really was. The range of colors they found was impressive. There were reds and pinks, blues, greens, and even that unusual purple. Each pigment came from a different source. The reds and yellows were made from iron-rich minerals. Greens came from stones like malachite. Blues were taken from azurite. The craftsmen were using whatever they could find in nature, showing a real knowledge of local materials. What stands out, though, is the purple. Unlike the other colors, it wasn't just ground up from a mineral. The purple came from an advanced, early chemical process, unique to ancient China. It took quartz, barium, and other ingredients, all heated and blended together to make a color that didn't exist in nature. That kind of chemistry was rare for the time, and it shows how far these artisans were willing to go to get things right.
This purple wasn't just about showing off technical skill. It meant something. In the Qin dynasty, purple was a color for royalty, for power and status. Using it on the warrior's armor and clothing was a way to show the emperor's authority, even in the afterlife. The fact that the craftsmen made it from scratch, instead of settling for easier colors, says a lot about their priorities. They wanted these figures to look impressive, and they wanted them to send a message. The paint wasn't just thrown on at random. Every detail had a purpose. Warriors' tunics and armor were painted with deep reds and browns, while their belts and trim had touches of blue and green. Faces and hands were given soft pinks to make them look more lifelike. Even the eyes had detail, whites and pupils carefully painted in. When you think about it, the whole army would have looked like it was ready to step off the platform and march away. The colors made the figures seem alive, not just statues. It's hard to picture now, with most of the paint gone, but the original effect must have been striking. The process of painting the warriors was just as careful as the sculpting. Craftsmen would have had to mix the pigments, apply them in layers, and make sure everything looked just right. Some of the paints were mixed with natural binders to help them stick to the clay. The fact that any color survived at all is a testament to how well the original work was done, and to the unique conditions underground that kept the colors sealed in for so long.
Preserving what's left of the color is still a big challenge. Modern researchers are trying new methods all the time. Everything from special chemical sprays to vacuum chambers that mimic the underground environment. The goal is to keep the pigments from breaking down any further, and maybe even find ways to restore some of what's been lost. It's a tough job, and every time a new figure is brought to the surface, there's a race to save as much color as possible before it fades. The responsibility is huge. The colors aren't just decoration. They're a record of ancient Chinese technology, art, and culture. The pigments also tell us about the world the craftsmen lived in. The reds and yellows from iron, the greens from malachite, the blues from azurite. These all point to a deep understanding of the natural world. The synthetic purple is a sign of early innovation, a willingness to experiment and push boundaries. The way the colors were used shows a sense of order and symbolism. Reds for strength, purples for authority, greens and blues for detail and contrast. Nothing was accidental. Even now, with most of the paint gone, you can still see traces of what the army once was. In some places, a patch of red on a sleeve or a bit of green on a belt stands out against the gray. These fragments are reminders of the effort and artistry that went into every figure. The Terracotta army wasn't just about numbers or size. It was about creating something that felt real and important. But the paint is only part of the story. What's just as striking is that each warrior looks different. The colors brought them to life, but it's the faces, the stances, and the details that make you stop and wonder. Why did the craftsmen bother to make every single figure unique? What were they trying to say by giving each warrior his own features? That's the next thing to think about. What if each clay warrior really did have a story to tell?
Looking closer at the Terracotta army, you start to notice how much individuality is built into every single figure. At first, you might expect to see rows of nearly identical soldiers, but that's not what's actually there. Each warrior is different. Faces are shaped in all sorts of ways, with some having sharp cheekbones, others with rounder jaws, and a mix of wide and narrow noses. The hairstyles stand out too. You can see everything from tight buns to looser, longer styles, each one carefully sculpted. This isn't just about making the army look interesting. These details actually signal rank and role in the emperor's forces. The more elaborate the ha gear or hairstyle, the higher the status of the figure.
Generals have more detailed armor and commanding poses, while lower-ranking soldiers show plainer gear and more rigid stances. The decision to make every warrior unique wasn't just for show. It reflects a real understanding of military hierarchy and order. The craftsmen who built the Terracotta army paid attention to how a real army would have looked, right down to the smallest differences. Some figures even bear workshop stamps, almost like ancient signatures, showing which team or individual was responsible for making them. These marks are a reminder that the army wasn't just thrown together. It was a huge, coordinated project, with each workshop adding its own touches to the final result. You can see that the individuality goes beyond just the faces and hair. Even the postures and the way each figure stands out from the next give you a sense of diversity. Some are relaxed, others look more alert, and the armor is never quite the same from one warrior to another. This kind of variation, down to a warrior's gaze, shows that the craftsman invested personality into each piece, a point underscored by those stamped workshop marks. It's not hard to imagine that these artisans took pride in their work, trying to make each figure stand out in some way, even if only a little.
There's also a practical side to all this detail. The army is arranged in careful formations, with generals up front, foot soldiers in lines, and cavalry and chariots in their own sections. If every figure looked exactly the same, it would be hard to tell who was supposed to be who. By making each one unique, the craftsmen helped reinforce the sense of a real, organized military unit. When you see the rows of warriors, you can pick out the leaders, the specialists, and the regular troops just by looking at their features and gear. That level of realism is what makes the Terracotta army feel more like a snapshot of a living army than a simple burial offering. Some experts propose these faces may have been inspired by actual Qin troops, though we can't confirm that yet. The idea is that the craftsmen might have used real people as models, capturing details from soldiers they saw every day. Whether or not this is true, the effect is the same. The army feels grounded in reality, not just imagination. The unique features give the sense that each warrior could have had a life and a story before being immortalized in clay. The regional diversity in the warriors' appearances is another clue about the society that made them. Historians know that Qin Shi Huang's empire stretched across a huge area, and his army included people from many different regions. By looking at the facial features and hairstyles, archaeologists have found signs that the figures represent a mix of backgrounds, not just people from the area around Xi'an. This matches up with historical records that describe the Qin army as being made up of recruits from all over the empire, including conquered territories. The army, then, is not just a symbol of military power, it's a record of the diversity and reach of the Qin dynasty.
It's also worth mentioning that this individuality isn't something you find in every ancient army. In a lot of other places and times, soldiers in art and sculpture are shown as nearly identical, with only minor differences to set them apart. The Terracotta army goes in the opposite direction, making every figure stand out. That decision says a lot about what the craftsmen and their emperor valued. They wanted to show not just strength, but complexity. They wanted the army to look real, not just impressive. Even now, the uniqueness of each figure helps researchers piece together new information. By studying the workshop stamps, the different styles, and the materials used, archaeologists have been able to figure out how the army was built and organized. Every detail adds a bit more to the story, helping us understand not just the army, but the people who made it and the world they lived in. What's striking is how all this effort and attention to detail was hidden for so long. The army stood buried for centuries, each figure's individuality sealed away and forgotten. When the site was finally uncovered, it wasn't just the scale of the discovery that surprised people.
It was the realization that every single warrior had been given so much care and thought. The Terracotta Army stands as a reminder of how much we can learn from the choices people made thousands of years ago, and how those choices still shape what we know about them today. This kind of detail and individuality doesn't just tell us about the soldiers or the emperor. It gives us a way to see the values, skills, and ambitions of the whole civilization. The Terracotta Army isn't just a collection of statues. It's a record of a society that cared about order, realism, and the legacy it left behind. And even now, as we look at these clay soldiers, we're left wondering what else their creators wanted us to understand.